supply chain drivers. With us today, we have Andrew Dogal and Felipe Araújo. Good morning, both.
Morning.
Morning.
Morning and good evening for you, because I'm in Brazil, 7 a.m. For you is 6 p.m. for you, Felipe,
Yes, in
and
Singapore. Yep.
Singapore. And for you, Dogal, is 10, 11,
11 in Germany, yep.
Germany. Perfect. Could you please introduce yourselves? Felipe, can you start, please?
Sure, no problem. Thanks so much, Professor, for the invitation. My name is Felipe, originally from Brazil. Have been working most of my career in supply chain in different businesses in oil and gas, more recently in mining. Most of the time in supply chain, like I mentioned, currently based in Singapore, but have spent time also in China, Australia, besides Brazil, and been doing business across most continents. So yeah, looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Felipe. Please, Dogal, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Armando, for the invite for today. I'm excited to take part in the conversation. My name is Andrew Dougal. I have been working also in supply chain for around 20 years, mainly across consumer goods and then into mining, but in between working in consulting. So across several different sectors, and then also within supply chain across plan, source, make, and deliver areas of the supply chain structure. So have lots of kind of experience and lessons learned, but lots more to learn, no doubt.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew Dogal. Thank you very much. Please, sirs, how can we compare supply chain in different regions of the world? I mean, in terms of models, technologies, competitiveness, how do you compare these things of supply chain? Could you please start? Which one?
Felipe, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I would like to start answering this question, Cavanya, with a reflection on where we are, not only in terms of supply chain, but market-wise, economy-wise, and so on. So as I reflect on it, I think about where we were 20 years ago when I started working, and most of my generation got into supply chain. And there was a very famous best-selling book called The Road is Flat, that described what was then understood as the as the playing field we were, and we expected to be in that playing field forever. It was a world where barriers had been removed since the end of the Cold War. It was a world where technology came and integrated. It was a world where all the force of free market were proving to be, the way to do business, and it was definitely working for most players around the world, right? So there was growth, there was something in it for everyone. So if you would ask most professionals, they would say, okay, this is how the world is, and that's how the world is going to continue to be. But here we are, 15 years later. The book is from 2005. And when you look back, we actually see that not everything went that way, right? Particularly, I think what we observe is that back then we were seeing China emerging and becoming already the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Uh, Back then, there was a view of leveraging that. There was a view of I was doing procurement back in Brazil. I had colleagues doing in Europe and US, and everyone was very keen to open. It was very trending to opening these international procurement offices to source from China to the world. And there was a view that everyone could benefit from this. However, what happened over time as things evolved, China not only continued to be a great manufacturer, but started to go into technology, started to compete. At the same time, we had other forces in geopolitics, other forces in trading that complicated the equation and really changed the way things were done. So back to your question, Kevin, about how supply chain is done differently across each region. I think we went from a situation where everyone was playing pretty much the same game of free market, of course, with loads of exceptions, right, in niches and so on, into a world where now everyone's interest is very different based on where they are in the development. We have COVID coming even more recently and making things even more complicated, where there are concerns with protectionism, creating contingency in the supply chain. So the way I see it is we do have the traditionally developed world concerned about these trends. They are in the midst of coming up with terms with this new environment, being mindful that only through innovation and differentiation they can continue to compete. But seeing that competition coming from China, for instance, is also going to this area of innovation and technology too. Other markets like Latin America, for instance, continue to be, despite of a lot of talk, but continue to be very, very heavily dependent on commodities only, and with very limited presence in the game in terms of value-added products. So supply chain professionals need to adapt and now take into consideration these movements that are happening across each of these regions with the world that is no longer so flat as it used to be.
Great, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, I would kind of add to that from a maybe different lens in terms of the experience that I've had around supply chain. So I think a good supply chain delivers what the business needs. So if you think about, what that means, it means putting your customer, your internal customers first, and fundamentally that should also be putting your external customers first, and then trying to figure out a method to deliver to them that meets their expectations around quality, service, costs. And so, I think, as Felipe said, there's lots of changes that have happened through my years in supply chain, and no doubt those changes are accelerating. So, digital technology is coming, but actually there's macroeconomic things that are impacting how a supply chain might run, whether that be, the COVID situation that we're facing at the moment. And then, I think wider than that, then you've also got these natural disasters that I think will become more prevalent as global warming spreads and causes more issues for supply chain. So if you look at the kind of shocks that come in supply chain, what I think is happening is there's probably more shocks coming, and therefore the need for a supply chain to be resilient is becoming more important than it has been maybe in the past, in terms of, that they're becoming longer with international sourcing, as Felipe said. That creates geographic challenges. Then you've got these shocks that come in, like COVID, like Fukushima, for example, in Japan, like Brexit in the UK. I was reading on the weekend that 68% of exports have dropped from pre-Brexit to post-Brexit from the UK into Europe. So, huge impacts to businesses in the UK, to supply chains that were relying on that volume for growth. And then, then you've just got the standard basic, how do you run your supply chain in an efficient way, which I think those kinds of things remain consistent, but I think you've got more technology to help support them then. I mean, I think this kind of concept of, how do you compare across regions is quite complex. And I think it would be unfair probably to generalize. My experience, for example, is, if you look at, say, things like safety, and in-vehicle monitoring systems, we found it much easier to put in-vehicle monitoring systems into our suppliers in Africa than we did in Europe, because of some of the data protection regulations. So actually, the supply chain that we were running in Africa was significantly more advanced from a safety perspective than one in Europe. And so, I think we've got to park these concepts of any market being further ahead. I think there's a good practice for supply chain that we should look to try and implement. And then we need to try and figure out how to make that work in each of the different geographies in which we operate.
Perfect. Andrew, you mentioned the word resilience, supply chain resilience, and Felipe mentioned the word contingencies. Could you please both explain what does it mean for you, Andrew? First, resilience.
Yeah, I mean, I think any good supply chain should have a good understanding of what happens in a disaster situation, or even in a situation where there's a short supply. And so you need to approach your sourcing strategies and your supply chain strategies with some level of redundancy built in. Now, the problem with that for most businesses is that it comes at a cost. So if you decide to spread volume between two suppliers instead of putting all of your volume with one, then you'll probably end up paying slightly more. And the question that mature organizations, I think, can handle is they are prepared to pay that for the valuation of the risk. I mean, if you look at really, situations where you have these significant shocks in the supply chain. I mean, there's classic examples of that. For example, in I think the Fukushima situation, where a lot of suppliers were relying on a chip manufacturer close to the plant. That obviously that plant shut down and they weren't able to get those chips. The suppliers that were quick at realizing that situation and had strong relationships with their second suppliers were able to quickly secure that volume to make sure their supply chain was able to be sustainable. And I think that those are the kinds of businesses that are advanced versus the laggards in terms of their ability to quickly digest information, to make quick decisions around where they can move volume, and actually place contracts to enable that volume to bring into their supply chain. And I think that's what I think, great businesses, that's the difference between a good supply chain and a not so good supply chain, is that ability to act quickly, to understand the data that's driving their business, and to make decisions that keep their business operating and keep their costs low, so they can be competitive in the market, which is I believe, and will continue to be, a global market.
Yeah, perfect. And Felipe, what do you mean with supply chain contingencies? Is it including the shortage of cost, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it relates very well with a lot of things that Andrew mentioned. I would just add, besides just, of course, geographical and distance and events like you mentioned, Andrew, I think more and more geopolitical events, concerns about whether a certain country we want to supply to another country, they are gaining a lot of importance. So of course, now distribution of vaccines for COVID are a great example of that, right? Discussions between UK and the European Union. In the beginning of COVID, I think we all heard about shortage of masks, gloves, and so on. So there are a lot of geopolitics playing.
Yeah, toilet paper in the United States was crazy.
Exactly, for hoarding, right? So you have all of this, and then there is a greater, what you call me first approach, that probably wasn't there so much before. A lot thanks to polarization in politics. There are other phenomena happening, right, that are described about the impact of social media into how people go a little bit too radical on their line of thought. So with leaders, as we had until very recently in US, as we still have in other countries around the world, and these things don't help in such situations for fair and orderly distribution of goods. So having contingents that will consider, of course, natural disasters, that will consider just lead times, but also that consider these sort of situations become increasingly important. If anything, just seeing the glass half full and trying to make it exciting for supply chain professionals. I think in my experience, most of the time, supply chain professionals would see this and they would have a decent understanding of the risks involved. However, it would sound a little bit too theoretical, too abstract to sell a strategy to for someone to pay a little bit more, like Andrew said, right? It comes with a cost, but it's very intangible and it's very hard for executives to take decisions based on a risk of an event that they have not seen in their lifetime.
So I think it can keep the business working.
Exactly.
Keep the business working. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly, and saving as much as possible for the short term. So I think, again, like I said, seeing the glass half full is a fantastic moment for supply chain to prove its value and risk management to do put in practice these contingencies that will help the business survive and navigate this changing world, right?
That's right. That's good. Let me ask you, the coming technologies, IoTs, machine learning, artificial intelligence in the broad sense, uh, and the huge automation wave that's coming very, very strong. How these tools are influencing supply chain, Dogo?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll maybe start here and just kind of discuss my view around a principle about digital. I think digital isn't anything particularly new. I think it's becoming the word is quite overused and quite broad, so it's quite difficult to understand what people mean. But I think if you look back at IoT as an example, there was a lot of organizations 15, 20 years ago that were using IoT devices quite effectively in their supply chain. So, you look at Caterpillar, you look at Rolls-Royce and what they were doing in terms of remote diagnostics at that time. The technology has been around for a while. The key question is, how do you use that technology as an enabler to your business? So, it's very easy to get lost and to chase down rabbit holes around technology. But I think the important thing is, first of all, it has to be appropriate for your business. Second, you've got to have a strategy. So you've got to say, okay, well, what's my architecture, and then what are the key projects that fit within that architecture to make sure the data talks to each other, as opposed to running it project by project and developing individual tools for specific areas of your supply chain. And then I think the key thing about any digital enablement is around data. So if your data isn't correct, then there's very little point in spending lots of money on getting nice fancy IoT devices around your supply chain, because fundamentally you need to have the data to enable the effective decisions. So I think my view is organizations need to understand their architecture. They need to understand how they're going to manage data, and how easily and how quickly can they update that information to then enable them to look at the data that's coming out of the systems they decide to put in place to make effective decisions to try and drive their business. I mean, it comes down to that point at the very beginning. Who's your customer? What value are you going to add by taking specific actions? And then how do you come up with a plan as a supply chain professional within a business to actually drive value for that business, as opposed to chasing the trendy next buzzword, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to add value to the business.
Andrew, supply chain is using correctly the data, the amount of data they provide. Let's say every day they are uploading this data. They are supply chain people using correctly the data?
Well, I mean, again, it's difficult to make generalizations, but I think a lot of people talk about areas of their supply chain around automation, but then if you actually challenge and understand how accurate the data is, I think that's where a lot of people are falling over. So I think, yes, we'd all like to have better quality data. Has been my experience throughout my supply chain. And sometimes, I think, we're going to talk to skills later on, but sometimes you need to make decisions without having perfect data, and that's an important skill set to have. But I think, I think as organizations mature, their data, a key part of that maturity is actually the quality of the data that's going into their system and the quality of how the different parts of that system are talking to each other. And that's what I see as being a mature supply chain organization. So I think, your question, Armando, is really one about mature organizations. Yes, probably organizations that aren't catching up quick enough and are falling further behind are those that aren't focusing on data and making sure that it can communicate around their business correctly.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Felipe, and I mean, data for you is something strong, important in supply chain. How do you see that? And the automation, a good question that I wanted to make for you, the huge automation wave that's coming.
Yeah, completely agree with Andrew. They say data is the new oil, right? Is the new greatest currency in the world that's going to generate a lot of value. I think data, to some extent, is underutilized utilized by supply chain. Of course, generalizing a lot. There are companies that are more advanced, others that are less advanced. But my observation is in comparison with other functions in the organization, because supply chain, to a great extent, again, in many organizations, has been closer from back office than the front office, right? So received less investment to leverage all the data that is there. So we see a lot of companies. I just recently read an article about a very prestigious software company that sells some of the most advanced software in the world, but they themselves in their supply chain are using ERPs of more than 20 years. So supply chain in it as a function, I think, has a gap, even though data might not be perfect, but there is still more that could be done with the data that's there. I think a lot of this is just thanks to the provider supply chain is yet to gain in the organizations as an activity that generates a lot of value. Said that, I think that there are two different ways that digitalization can happen. One is through just optimization. And that's going to drive you cost reduction, that's going to drive you efficiency and so on. And another one that we see more and more companies going through is by enabling completely new business models, right? We see all the Ubers of the world, WeChat coming from China, where through new technology applied in supply chain, in activities that are very, very much relevant to supply chain, you generate new business. So I think that there is going to be a sort of a leapfrog, because to some extent, optimization is still going to be there as a major destination of adoption of investment in digitalization in supply chain. But the order of the magnitude of the benefits through new business is going to be generated is going to be even greater, and it's going to make it accelerate even further.
And automation, Andrew and Felipe, how do you see automation, the huge wave that's coming for supply chain in terms of storage for everything?
Well, yeah, again, for me, it comes down to how standard are your processes across your organization, how good is your data, because you can see automation having an impact in those areas where that's cleaner. But if a lot of that information isn't standard, or if you're not completing processes in a more standard way, that automation is more difficult to enable. However, saying that, obviously the benefits of automation are huge, right? So the concept is, you take away the transactional activities within an organization, you automate them, whether that be, let's talk some examples. So you might automate how your ERP system orders a product. So it sees a demand, it sees a stock reducing, and it places an automatic purchase order because you've got a contract in the system, you've got a demand, and it can automate the PO. So therefore, zero touch in terms of individuals within the organization. But still, adds value in terms of replenishing your supply chain to the right amount, to the right locations, hopefully, assuming all of that data is correct. So I think, the benefits are huge in terms of you can either take people out of your organizations, or you can redeploy them. So fundamentally, I mean, if you think about, a load of people doing the same thing every day, that's not as value add as those people maybe looking for opportunities, those people going out and helping customers to deliver more value. So I mean, my view in automation is it's a key lever to try and help deliver, as Felipe said, both growth in terms of new business opportunities. So again, Rolls-Royce, Caterpillar, they were using it to diagnose when equipment would go down, and therefore fix it more effectively, and therefore have better machine operability in the field. So straight away, better value for them in terms of their customers' assets running more effectively. Likewise in other businesses, there's opportunities for that revenue stream, but then there's also opportunities for saying, look, we've got all this human capital, how can we use them more effectively to drive value for our business? And I think that's a really exciting thing that I see around automation, that it will enable more effective and more exciting conversations with consumers about adding value.
more, Felipe, more related to the repetitive processes than the variation processes. How do you deal automation with variations?
Yeah, that's the challenge, I think, of this decade, right? So you do want that the gain of scale that only repetition will allow you. But if anything, that 2020 proved us, you need to have flexibility to change as you go. So in my view, this is a fascinating topic. In my view, supply chain organizations need to have human capital that is capable of adapting, leveraging technology on the go. So rather than I think that's a recent observation. Rather than what probably I would see myself a few, maybe 5 years ago, that you just go strong, go bold one way. You need to have enough capacity in your own organization to very quickly adapt. And I think that the new wave, I agree with Andrew, digitalization is a big buzzword, but the new wave of technology that is becoming available to us can help us dramatically. So I think the number one thing when it comes to digitalization that supply chain organizations should think of, it might sound contradictory, Cavanha, but is not about what software you're going to implement, what sort of a buzzword you're going to go for. What team will you have with people? Should you have data scientists in your team? Probably yes. Should you have data engineers in your team? Probably yes. And everyone else should, at the minimum, be able to communicate with these people so that organization can very quickly respond to this change that will come, maintaining the level of automation that once was only achieved if you were living a very static world, and allowing you time for these super smart people and excited people to then spend time on things like optimization, supply chain planning optimization in a world that is evolving. It might take you 6 months to optimize your network of a certain category, and then on the day one of implementation, there is a new tariff that comes, and then all your optimization analysis went wrong, right? So you need to have. You can't rely on a consultant that will come and that will do this optimization for you. You need to have that, and the investment is absolutely. I have great confidence that it will pay off because of what Andrew said. You can just pretty much just shift the resource that you had doing these repetitive activities into these more value-added ones.
Yeah, perfect. Andrew, we know that you have a very strong experience in UK, and nowadays you are working in Germany. How do you see the presence of the state government in the production arrangements? And because in Latin America, in Brazil especially, is very criticized the presence of the state as a kind of mind model that we try to copy from the United States, that state's not, let's say, around the businesses. What do you see this influence of state government in the supply chain set?
Yeah, I mean, without talking, too specifically about the UK and talking more broadly, I mean, my view is, any supply chain needs to understand the total cost of ownership within that business. So, if I'm deciding to take a product from China versus if I'm deciding to onshore a product, there should be some make or buy stroke understanding that comes in before you make those decisions. And I think as shocks happen, as legislative changes happen, that changes the mix in terms of you may decide to change your supply chain on the basis of those changes. And I mean, I think the key part of that is you try and model what you think will happen within those supply chains and what the potential impacts will be to enable you to make those decisions. I mean, my view is that organizations have a certain inertia and ability to make those changes, and especially if they've made significant investments in certain locations, it's very difficult to make changes to those investment decisions, especially when you're talking, significant values of money. Saying that, certain technologies are enabling more onshoring, which is quite exciting in terms of things like 3D printing and those kinds of technologies, and are enabling people to move things back to locations where the customers are, which enables shorter supply chains, which enables lower carbon supply chains, which enables quicker responsiveness to customers. And so, I think there's certainly, if you look at the kind of government impact on supply chains, yes, they definitely have an impact in terms of the legislation they put in place. But I think as a supply chain professional, it's our job not necessarily to try and challenge those, but to understand them and understand the impacts of those changes to our supply chains, and therefore try and make the right decisions for the businesses that we're working for. So, I think things like, the carbon footprint of a supply chain will become more and more important to consumers. And as a result, that will probably change behaviors as much as, what a government may say or may do. And so I think, the future will be very different today, is one thing we know. And it's our role as supply chain professionals to try and model, understand those impacts and those risks, and then put in place strategies to mitigate the risks and to try and deliver the value.
Good. Felipe, you have a very good experience in China. You lived a little bit there. And how do you see the local content, the protection of the local market with tariffs, with barriers that you cannot import or things like that? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think to a great extent, I mean, this has always been there and is going to continue to be there. I think in these recent years, we have probably, if anything, experienced a little bit less than probably we will see in the future. So it just increased the importance for supply chain people to be absolutely with the finger in the pulse and trying to be ahead of this, embedding, like we discussed, the contingents to be prepared for that. But besides that, I think there is another component that that is also emerging, which is to a great extent in areas of high value added and technology, where the market is changing at a very fast pace. Sometimes enterprise are driving it as strongly, or sometimes even more strongly, than governments themselves. We see with TikTok provoking US to have a response that was very similar to what they would condemn China for doing, right? So US barring TikTok from doing the business in the way they wanted in that place. So I think that the companies now have the ability to also influence this game, and I think supply chain professionals do have are going to be asked to provide their inputs on these events. So like Andrew mentioned about environment, about emissions, about I could add ethical sourcing. So whether you buy from a factory that has all certifications or not, we could add other areas of discrimination and support to minorities and so on. I think especially large enterprise can play a very leading role, and not only following these trends and trying to support what they think is the best for the collective.
Okay, Andrew.
I think I'd maybe add to that, Amanda. Just in terms of a good sourcing team should try and have a good understanding of not just the first tier suppliers that they have, but actually who's supplying those suppliers, right? So to give some examples, if you're managing a supplier that's delivering a product to your site, it is critical that you understand what subcontractors they're using and whether those subcontractors are following the same safety standards that you might be using. So I think what's good about legislation, and I mean we can talk about specifics, but a legislation that tries to level the playing field, for me, adds value. And we see that in the EU around things like CE marking. But in specific industries, there's other expectations, minimum expectations. I think setting those minimum expectations is something that governments do need to do, because businesses will always look for probably the easiest way of delivering a product at the best cost, because that's what the market drives. So I think it is important to have some level of legislation to try and drive good standards within a business. Maybe that's more of a personal opinion than anything else. But I think again, coming back to, okay, well, what does this mean for my supply chain? For my supply chain, that means I have a good understanding of supplier A versus supplier B, and what actually is happening further up their supply chain stream in terms of whether they've got anti-slavery legislation built into all of their practices, whether they've got a good understanding of their carbon footprint, whether they've got a good understanding of whether they're taking materials from a supplier that isn't compliant to global requirements. So I think that's what we can do to answer those questions. And I think personally, it's a good thing that there is a level playing field, as long as it doesn't hurt the consumers too much. So again, we're not going to solve that problem on this call, but I think our job as supply chain people is to understand those legislations, as I say, model them and try and understand the impacts, and then take corrective actions to try and reduce risks and deliver for our consumers.
And do you believe that globalization is at the end of the cycle, or only a small adjustment for the future?
I think I think it's a bit melodramatic to think that things will change that much. We've lost the capability to manufacture a lot of products in Europe that we might have had in the past, certainly at the kind of volume that we might need going forward. So there will be changes, and I think there will be a little bit more onshoring because of the technologies and because of the rapidly changing demand that then triggers a need to have more local sourcing to enable better responsiveness. But I mean, in terms of global supply chains, I think if anything, countries will develop their specialties. That will be where we continue to source our product from, and the businesses that are impacted by any legislative changes will push back and kind of lobby for changes in those practices. So I think globalization is here to stay, in my personal opinion. But I think as we've said all the way through this, the best thing that you can do is be prepared for change.
Yeah, total cost of ownership, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Felipe, you believe, and because the United States has UK and United States, they have a very strong initiative in terms of reshoring. They call it reshoring. Do you believe in reshoring?
I think these things. I completely agree with Andrew. I don't think globalization will go away. I think these are the forces that might be pulling us into different directions. They are only going to be effective to the extent that they create momentum for competitiveness to come, and then in the long term, you might have a market that was otherwise non-competitive to become competitive. Then, in effect, you can remove the protectionism, you reestablish the globalization again. So I think that these events will always be there, but as forces that are going to be pulling different strings in different directions to accommodate for, of course, the social needs of the different countries that are implicated in this. But if we would see this journey with as 100 years journey, I think globalization continues going with different players also, which again, depending where you are coming from, right? If you're coming from the position of someone that is getting disadvantaged from that, it's harder to appreciate that, right? We need to have the helicopter view.
Perception angle.
Exactly. And then you can see that things are going to be evolving. Of course, then we have to go back into geopolitics too. Of course, there's a very strong player here that's China. that tends to think a lot more long term than what we know as the Western world, right? So it's harder to see their move in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, a really interesting example that I read about recently, Armando, which I think demonstrates, the importance of other levers than just the geopolitical piece, is, an article about Toyota and their ability in certain Japanese factories now to manufacture almost, multiple wheel-based vehicles on a batch level of one, right? So that means, they might make a small Yaris, and they might make an SUV, one after the other in terms of the lines that they're able to run now. And they can now get their manufacturing costs in Japan down lower than the extra tariffs that have been added by the American government to try and onshore jobs. So, obviously there's two ways you could play that. You can say, okay, well, let's bring that competence and that technology and that, lean vision around the Toyota production system and try and get it implemented in some of our factories in America. Or you could just say, well, look, I mean, the dynamic of the situation is such that currently we can produce cheaper in Japan. And that's the way that we're going to supply vehicles into the North American market. I mean, it might look good on paper, but fundamentally, I think businesses make decisions based on that total cost of ownership. And I think, there's a lot of other factors here than just geopolitics that can impact which supply chain is most effective. And if an organization's run well, and if an organization has, clever principles that give it competitive advantage in terms of their manufacturing base, then actually, where you manufacture things is less relevant today than it might be. So I think each industry is different. People made a lot of noise about closing certain car plants in the UK because of Brexit, but actually fundamentally it was because of wider EU changes that were around, the percentage of parts that needed to be from within the EU. And so actually a lot of those plants just went back to Japan. They didn't go to another location in Europe. And so, I think a lot can be said and a lot of noise can be made, but fundamentally, if you're businesses, you're looking at, okay, what's the most effective and efficient way of delivering? And that's where I'm saying, certain legislation can actually help change some of those decisions. But we've got to make them for the right reason. So, if it's about job creation, if it's about environmental improvement, then I think those are potentially good reasons to make changes. But you've got to realize that businesses will make decisions based on what they see as their P&L impacts.
A certain level of legislation, not too much to not interfere in the market too much, but a certain level to make the things working fine. Let me bring the last issue that I would like to bring to you about the supply chain professionals' skills. How do you see the must-have and the should-have skills for supply chain professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple routes that you can go in terms of supply chain. So I guess I want to start by saying, I think supply chain is one of the most exciting routes to go down. Obviously, that's a path that both Felipe and I followed, but it's an area to work in within a business that is always different, that requires lots of engagement. So, you need to talk to people, you need to talk to suppliers, you need to talk to stakeholders all the way through. And it's often a very fundamental part of a business without necessarily being what it sells itself as its core. So having an effective supply chain is something that you don't celebrate when it's working well, but when it's not working well, people really make a lot of noise about it. I mean, in terms of skill base, I think my advice is get involved in one of those areas. If you're coming new into supply chain area, get involved in one of the areas around digital that we spoke to before. So try and immerse yourself in that area, because clearly that's an area that supply chain is changing. But then in terms of career planning around supply chain, I think there's lots of different options for people. So I think there's options to go a more general path where you get experience across plan, source, make, and deliver. And then there's other options where you might specialize in one of those and become a real expert. And I think there's no right or wrong way. I think there's career paths in both. And that's a really exciting thing. I mean, I think in terms of core skill sets, I think, having an ability to analyze numbers is obviously critical. An ability to work with people is also really important. whether that be, across multiple cultures and trying to understand cultural perspectives, whether it be working in matrix organizations, which is more prevalent in today's, larger global organizations, and the ability to understand how that works and how to be effective. And then, the leadership skills, I think that you develop over time in the supply chain, whether that be, I talk to people in sourcing and procurement who say, well, I've got no team management experience, but yet they're managing stakeholder teams of 15, 20 people to try and land a contract. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for people to get all of those different skills as they go through whichever track, whether it be a more generalist or a more specialist track. And I think, from my experience, one of the areas that I found the most valuable is kind of going back into a consulting role in the middle of my career enabled me to get the kind of take the step back a bit and get a bigger picture view. So an ability to think in first principles and go back to, okay, well, how should this work? And then what does this mean for how it's working today? And how do I help close those gaps? Is something that I've always found really valuable as a core skill set within supply chain, within business in general.
Great, thank you. Felipe, please.
Yeah, I think just to add, of course, I agree with everything Andrew said. If I would focus on the new skills, right? So what are the things that are in this new world that we are going to become prevalent? So besides digitalization, I think we spoke a little bit about driving flexibility, people that will want to and are keen to and like change. They don't necessarily like things done the same way multiple times. I see this as a change. When I started in this, it was a lot the other way around, right? So minimize the change, don't disrupt things, try to run things the same way many times. I think there is an element of that. Another one, and this one, it can be very debatable. So it's just exactly for the purpose of the discussions that we are having here. Something about values, something about what one person believes in. So correlating with a few points that Andrew mentioned about environment, talking about labor and eventually illegal use of labor. The market is demanding, the consumers are demanding a different type of supply chain from what used to have before. They are demanding a different type of performance from companies from what they used to have. You have now not uncommon to see consumers boycotting retailers that will buy that are found to be buying from factories that were employing child labor. A supply chain professional that just wants to do the job and that's keen to do the right thing. I've had this experience myself in companies I've worked with. You could go and do the tick the box exercise of doing the inspection, for instance, on the factory you source from, and you stop there. Or you can do, like Andrew said, you can go one level down and see who they source from. Or you could even have this example that I've seen. You go, you audit the plant, and the plant is perfect, it's pristine, and then all of a sudden you hear that there is something wrong, and you get a complaint. When you go examine, actually you figure out that that supplier was actually selling you 2.5 times their capacity to supply. So a good supply chain professional in ethical sourcing will go beyond. There is something about believing in what they're doing that they will go beyond just getting the certificate and getting out of there and really chasing the events that are just not aligned with the values that are prevailing in today's world. We can see, for instance, just very recently, ExxonMobil was removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. A lot of these coming from pressure for green and Exxon not following that trend. I had the privilege to work for Exxon for 8 years in the start of my career. Amazing company to work for, a company that will drive that standardization, repetition, doing everything very similarly, not taking risks and so on. So I think new supply chain, especially leaders, they must have some drive themselves to push for this change. The emissions now from the Paris Protocol and other accords, they go beyond just your carbon footprint, right? For the scope 2, scope 3, they go down the chain. So supply chain, to make this change, there will be an element of trade-offs that are going to go beyond the total cost of ownership. For a while, you might have to pay a little bit more to get there.
Okay.
I think one part, Amanda, that you can.
And please include your 1 minute conclusion for each one.
So just very quickly on the skills one, I think I mean we'd be remiss to have a conversation about supply chain skills and not talk about Excel. So I think people need to be good at Excel. I mean, I think the further thing I'd add in terms of advice to people is obviously, you know, the best place to learn is obviously on the job. So learn the systems that you're working with. You know, have the inquisitive mind that Felipe spoke about. Try and understand as much as you can about your business, because fundamentally that's always going to help you. Everything you put in will normally come out. And then if you want to get, you know, additional skills to build on your CV, I think there's opportunities on things like edX and LinkedIn Learning and those kinds of systems programs for you to further develop your skills. So, you know, I think there's great opportunities within businesses, and then there's opportunities to further add to your skills to develop your skill set over time. So look, I mean, in terms of summarizing, I think my main view is, you know, we spoke about, are there big differences in supply chain? Yes, there is, region to region based on local legislation, but fundamentally, you know, the same principles should apply across all supply chains, which is, you know, understand your customer, understand the needs of the business, and make sure that you've got an understanding of the total cost of the supply chain to enable it to deliver, and then what your plan is to improve it fundamentally, because, you know, every day you need to be thinking about how do you improve to be competitive. If you look at digital, I think, yes, overly used buzzword, but has a huge place for the future of supply chain in terms of automation and simplifying the business to enable people to do more with less. And then we spoke about, you know, globalization. Fundamentally, again, it comes down to that point around what's your total cost, and as we evolve our thinking, that total cost will be a lot more than just a dollar value. It will be a embedded carbon value. It will be a anti-slavery value. It will be all of these different aspects that will add further depth to your understanding of the supply chain. And then finally, I think on skills, we said, you know, learn on the job, be inquisitive, get good at Excel, and you know, always ask questions, because that's a way that you kind of learn and you build your experience.
And you brought three concepts, very important three concepts, Andrew: TCO, resilience, and a certain level of legislation to drive the complete supply
level
chain.
Playing field. Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. Felipe, please, your 1 minute conclusions.
Yeah, I think very exciting moment to be in supply chain, and which is a very exciting function. I think innovation will come through a lot of bottom-up initiative inside supply chain, and coming from supply chain into the rest of the organization. The industry and different markets are not short of examples where, through trying to create just some simple optimization, completely new business models were developed. So more than ever, through digitalization, these opportunities are out there. And I think the winning companies in supply chain will encourage this type of collaboration, of people provoking and bringing different ways to do things into the agenda.
You brought two very important concepts, Felipe, for me, for my understanding. Contingencies, very strong one, and beyond supply chain base, so seeing something more than only supply chain. It was a pleasure for me to have you both, Felipe Araújo and Andrew Dougal. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having
us.
us.
So much. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.